So I went in, I kind of just like touched things up a little bit. I went and kind of like added a little bit of brown. It still looks very pink. Maybe it's because I'm wearing pink. I'm not sure, but it is definitely more of like a warm brown. And I tend to use like warmer shades on people when I am doing old age makeup, because I don't necessarily want something to be so cool that it reads like very, very gray on stage, but I don't want it to read super, super red either. So that's why sometimes I do kind of like to go in with like a combination of like creams and powders, just because like if I do my cream and I decide like, oh, that's like a little bit too red, if I go in with like a powder that's a little bit cooler, or vice versa, that can kind of help it get to like the correct shade. And then just in case, like if anybody kind of wants to see like, the color palette, so I'm using, Krylon came out with like an old age wheel, so I've just been using this. So there's like a purple, I have white, I have really dark brown, I have like a taupey color, a creamy color, and then kind of like a medium brown. I would say for most people, you will get pretty much whatever you need out of this, but it is missing something like a little bit yellowy. So if you have anybody with like a deeper skin tone, you're probably going to need something with a little bit of yellow, just because that cream is not necessarily going to be right for everybody's highlight shade, but kind of like this kind of like spectrum of colors is definitely not a bad place to start. So that's what I've been using for mine. But there's a lot of like the theatrical brands, like I said, that make like old age wheels, but you can also just use like foundations and your concealers, your contours, whatever works is totally appropriate for this. So now we kind of have to talk about how we're going to blend things out. So me personally, I definitely, as much as I do like theatrical makeup, I struggle with it, and I struggle with things kind of not getting to this point of being super like subtle and blended, at least like subtle in a, like a theatrical sense. So I know when I learned like extreme old age and like operatic old age in school, I had a really hard time with it, just because I really love blending things, and I like when things are like nicely blended. So it's hard to find that balance between like being blended but still like strong and bold and like readable from stage. So this is not necessarily my finest thing that I do, but I do think it is an important skill to learn, just because you might end up working in like a giant theater one day, and a lot of times for operas or for like these really large theaters, they do have the makeup artists are actually like working and doing the makeup on people, so it is something that you might have to do. So now we're going to go in and blend. So when I'm blending, I'll either use like kind of like a rounded brush to do it. I'll use these sponges a lot too. I don't personally like to use like beauty blenders, but if that's what you like to use, that's fine. You can use like, I have like some blending brushes. Like sometimes I'll use like stuff like this. It just kind of depends like the part of my face that I'm working on. But I find for like this more like fine details, if you use like the pointier end of your sponge and you just kind of pull it back and forth, that's going to help you have a defined line, but like a blended line. So we can kind of start with doing that first. And so with these, I'm just sort of like pulling it back and forth. And then that's kind of helping blur everything out. So like anywhere where I want to have like a more defined line, I can kind of go in and just pull this back and forth. Around the eyes, a lot of times when people, especially for when I'm working on someone else, I like to use brushes, just because I think that this gets like a little bit invasive almost, and it can be a little bit tricky, and you just always want to be really careful when you are working around eyes. And so I'm just going to kind of like push the makeup back and forth, and that's going to help me kind of like keep this definition, but it still has sort of like a blend to it at the same time. I usually feel like it looks a little bit crazy until the highlight gets on, but I still like to do this before I do the highlight, just so that way I kind of have a guide where it can go, because to me, if I like find all my shadows, then I know where the highlights need to go. It's just a lot harder for me to like look at someone's face and like finding where all the highlights need to go without knowing what parts are gonna like cave in, sort of. But again, that's just me, and you may not feel that way. So when you are blending this, especially around the hairline, I feel like I like to kind of like pull it in towards the hair, and it's almost like it should become sort of like a gradient. So I can take something like a little bit more in here if I feel like it's not giving me enough of that gradient. And you can sort of, and again, remember, like, we are going to have some highlight and stuff thrown in like this, but for now, we do want to try to blend it. So you can kind of see, like, I mean, again, this is something where, like, you definitely have to step away from yourself because it is very scary up close. But it does sort of have this nice, like, deep line, but then it does kind of blur out. So that's kind of what you're going for, where, like, on this side, it's really, like, a very, very subtle shadow, especially compared to how this is. And now for this area, so I will kind of connect everything so that the whole face has this sort of shading, especially like if somebody has like wigs or hair. You want to make sure that this blends back into that, just so that when they put like the like lace front down or whatever it's going to be, there's not just like a line where the makeup stops and then there's like lace and then there's like their actual hair. I like it to go all the way back into somebody's hairline because I think that just helps it look like a little bit more natural. And so for the cheek, I can still get, and like I did start to do it a little bit, you can still get like this really nice definition without it being like a crazy straight line. So for this, I'm going to be pulling it down, and I feel like a lot of the times when you are blending your shading, the colors are kind of going down when you do it, and then so you can like drag it back and forth. And since I'm working on a larger area, I'm using like a larger part of the sponge. That's also like kind of like a rule I feel like that I have, that the smaller the area, like the smaller the brush I'm working with, and then vice versa. A lot of times if I just have this in my hand, like you'll see I did all my like putting my color down with it, just because it's what I have, but certainly you could have used like a bigger brush for some places, but I've just found that like whatever area you're working on, it can make it go faster if you use a brush that's like more appropriate for that size. And a lot of times for theatrical makeup, we only have a couple of minutes to do things like this, so it's always good to like think of ways that you can like cut things down. And so again, we want to have that nice kind of like ombre effect, and for this, so it can still get kind of this like strong sort of like hollowed out like jaw moment, but if you like do look at this closely, it's very, very blurred out, very, very blended out, but even when I step further away, it still reads really nicely. So that's why it's like I see people like draw these like crazy dark lines. You don't have to do that. Like you can still get a lot of definition with just having like a shadow. So we can do that, and then we can do a little bit more with this one, but we do want this to be pretty prominent. And then if you ever blend things too much, like I just did, you can just go back in. I have really like prominent folds in my skin right here, but if you don't, if you have somebody smile, you can usually find it pretty easily. So for this area, I was like, okay, I used my sponge, it kind of blended everything too much. I'm going to go in with a brush that's a little bit smaller, and I can kind of do it that way. And that's something too, like, because I know myself and like I probably blended that too much, but I'm not super concerned about that right now. And then again for this, since it's a little smaller, we'll come in and blend it here, and really just to get this ombre, you're just going to be like pulling the color down more than anything else. And then for this you don't necessarily need to blend these too much, but I will usually still like pull the brush back and forth just a little bit, and so this is it's a little tricky for me to see this side of my face, but just want to make sure, as I've always taught in this class, right, that you don't want to be a floating head, so I am going to make sure that I blend this down my neck. So obviously if you're doing this much on your face and your neck is going to be showing, I could not leave my neck like this on stage. I would need to also age my entire neck, but a lot of times you kind of just hope that the costume designer will kind of help you out and like put somebody in a scarf, or like you won't have to age their hands because they're wearing gloves, or like their neck, the back of their neck's not showing, so you don't have to worry about that. But really like any part of someone that might be showing, you have to make sure that you have that kind of covered, just because you don't want like this to be like totally flawless and then like their neck is super young, or like their hands are super young and their nails are like hot pink or like glitter or something. Like you do have to think about like all of these tiny details. So again with this, and it kind of like you can kind of like blend this down, but then also up. So anywhere like a line like ends, that I kind of just like it to fade out nicely, and not have like a hard stop. And then with this, I'm going to work on like kind of pulling this down just a hint more, and same with up here. So really this is just kind of like a crease brush, I feel like, for eyes, but I found that it can actually be really useful for blending things out, especially when you're working on other people. Little rounded brushes like this can kind of get into areas that a lot of like other brushes and sponges can't. So I found that they can be really, really helpful. And again, we're just gonna kind of like bring this down. So we're getting like this nice like ombre. And then again, if I want this to go further, I can just pull the end. I didn't have to necessarily like draw it that way, but I'm still gonna get like a really nice, like a little fun little eye bag on this side. And then for the eyes, so that this just kind of gets sort of like that part of my eye is drooping, I'm gonna do the same thing, where I just kind of like pull this out and then kind of have like, so the line we put in right here and the line we put in here, it's almost like kind of like a rounded triangle, if that makes sense. So like the 2 points should kind of meet so that you can make it look a little bit more like that part of your eye is kind of like coming in. Usually on the eyelid, like I will darken it with some cream, but that's something I like to go in and do with powder a lot. Sometimes I make them like a little bit like pinkier if you're not doing like a fun like character eyeshadow or just kind of like a taupey brown. And obviously like pick the colors that are appropriate for the skin tone of the person that you're working on. But I find that if I put too much cream right here, even if I powder it down, it creases a lot. So I don't always go in and do that until like the end after I've set this, but I do like to have, like you can kind of see on this side, I do like to gray it out and like deepen it a little bit, just because you don't want to have like, especially if you have really like large eyes or anything, like you don't want to have like this really like young youthful eyelid while everything else is very like aged. So that's something definitely be aware of. But especially like me, like I know my skin, I'm very oily, so there's only like so much time that something like that can be on my face without it sort of like oiling back off, for lack of better words. And again, I kind of blended that a little bit too much, so I can go back in and kind of add it again. Like I said, like I have a really hard time not over blending things, and that's something that I've struggled with like since I was in school for theatrical makeup, is it can kind of be hard to like find the point to stop so that you don't overdo it, but it still has kind of like the effect that you want. So that's a little bit closer to what I'm wanting, but it's still a little bit tricky. And then I usually like to go in and add like, not necessarily like wrinkle lines, but I do like to have like some kind of like shading going on in here, just because again I think it's somewhere like, especially if you have someone that has like really like well shaped eyebrows, like if you have like this space is like very highlighted and nicely shaped, like it's gonna look a little bit too young probably for what you are doing. So I do like to go in and just kind of like deepen that just a little bit. So I'm going to go in, touch up a couple more things, blend it a little bit more, and then we're going to talk about placing your highlights.